Good evening, everybody. This is part 2 of the series on the first chapter of Sanhedrin. Last time I said we were doing Sanhedrin 2a through 2b. That's not actually true. We didn't even get to the bottom of 2a. So properly today is Sanhedrin 2a through 2b. And tonight we're gonna finish the Mishnah, the very long Mishnah, but we're gonna finish it. And then we are gonna start on the Gemara. This source packet, again, like the last one, does not have an outline at the end. This time mostly because due to Tisha B'Av, I ran out of time. But I'm hoping to get back to normal next week. If you are listening to a recording or watching a recording of this at some point in the future and you would like to see the packet, I'd be happy to email it to you. Email me at deborahklapper@gmail.com. Okay, so we are starting here where we left off last time. We had an extensive list of different kinds of legal issues, some legislative, some judicial, some somewhere in the middle, and how many judges would need to sit on a panel in order to make decisions about those things. And we noted that there's not a separation of powers between the judiciary and the legislature, and that they seem to be the same thing in this conception. I think there is intended to be a separate executive in the form of a king, although the king runs a sort of separate and parallel government. There is also presumably an enforcement arm of some sort of the judgment of the court. As we go through the Masechet, though, we'll see that that seems to be directly controlled by the court. It's not its own separate thing. Okay, so let's get started. We are here moving from the description of which kinds of courts are used for which things to defining the courts themselves and interrogating why the courts have those numbers. So Sanhedrin Gdola, a large Sanhedrin, Shel Shiv'im ve'echad, had 71 judges. Ktana Shel Esrim ve'shlosha, and a small Sanhedrin had 23 judges. Minayin ligdola shehi shel shiv'im ve'echad. So how do we know from the Torah that the large Sanhedrin is supposed to have 71 judges? Shene'emar esfali shiv'im ish miziknei Yisrael. So God tells Moshe in the 11th chapter of Bamidbar, go gather 70 men, and then Moshe puts together a sort of proto-government out of these 70 men. You'll remember that this is immediately followed by 2 more men prophesying in the camp, which upsets Yehoshua. And Moshe says, oh, if only everybody would prophesy. So that's where we are in the story. And it seems likely that those 2 extra men are because if you have 12 tribes and you take an even number of judges from each tribe, that would get you a panel of 72, not a panel of 70. And so the traditional understanding is that there was some sort of randomized method of removing 2 of them in order to get to the number 70 that God wanted. And those 2 guys who were prophesying were the 2 who had been chosen and then unchosen. In any case, so that gets you 70, but then the Mishnah says, Moshe al gabehan, and Moshe was in charge of them. So that's 70 plus 1, that would get you 71. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shiv'im, Rabbi Yehuda says the court is 70. The fact that Moshe is also supposed to be there in some kind of supervisory role doesn't count. We don't need to, when we're building a court in imitation of these 70 elders, we don't need to replace Moshe. We just need to replace the elders. So this is the question that came up in the questions at the end of last week's share. How do we know that the small Sanhedrin is supposed to have 23 judges? Shene'emar v'shaftu ha'ida v'hitzilu ha'ida. So as
Deborah,
Yeah.
Can I interrupt? I'm sorry. Rabbi Yehuda, so is he saying that the Sanhedrin should only have 70 people in it?
Yes. How he deals with the fact that we generally don't like even numbers,
Right.
is not clear to me. I think he just copes. But perhaps we'll see something more about that later.
Okay.
The Sanhedrin of that number was, I think, by Rabbi Yehuda's time disbanded. So it's a theoretical argument in his world. Although I'd have to look up exactly which generation of Tanaim he is. Because the Sanhedrin, the large Sanhedrin survives in Yavne even after Yerushalayim is destroyed, but it doesn't survive all the way until the writing of the Mishnah. At least I don't think so. So you can see from my translation here of Bamidbar 35, 24, and 25 that they left out a lot, right? They gave you a total of 4 words out of 2 whole psukim. So let's actually take a look at these psukim as they exist in their original Hebrew form. So I've opened the Tanakh here, and the context is that we've got a murder case in which it's ambiguous whether the murder was premeditated or was by mistake. And the Torah says, "V'shaftu ha'eda ben hamakeh uven goel hadam." The Eda, we're not going to translate that word for right now. The Eda will judge between the smiter, or the killer, or whatever you want to call him, and between the blood redeemer. The blood redeemer is the person who, the closest relative of the dead person, who, in the event of a murder that is negligent, right? Murder that's entirely not the fault of the person who committed it doesn't result in any kind of punishment. That's not your fault. If it's really entirely not your fault. But if you have a case where you didn't do it, but you could have prevented it, right? And the Torah's example of that, the Torah gives 2 examples. One is where you're climbing a ladder and the ladder breaks and you fall on the person underneath, where presumably you should have checked the ladder before you started climbing it to make sure it could hold your weight. And the other example is you're chopping wood with an axe, and the axe head, remember that we're dealing here with Bronze Age tools, so you've got a piece of metal which is tied with rope on a wooden handle, and the handle goes flying off and hits somebody in the head and kills them. And again, you shouldn't start chopping wood until first you check that your axe handle is attached properly to your axe blade. So those kinds of cases, the nearest relative of the deceased has the right to chase the killer, I don't want to call it murderer, to a refuge city. And if they catch them before they get to the refuge city, they have a right to kill them. That's the way that it seems like that here, though, there's a court that's intervening to decide whether this person is a deliberate killer or a negligent killer before that can happen. Okay, so the Eda is going to judge between the killer and the blood redeemer, al hamishpatim ha'ela, according to these laws. V'hitzilu ha'eda et harotzeach, and then the Eda will rescue the murderer. The Torah does use the word murderer, even though I didn't want to. Miad goel hadam, from the hand of the blood redeemer. V'heshivu oto ha'eda el ir miklato, and then the Eda is going to return the murderer to his city of refuge, asher nas shama, that he ran to, v'yashav ba, and then he has to stay there ad mot hakohen hagadol, until the kohen gadol dies. Asher mashach b'shemen hakodesh, who was anointed with the anointing oil. So we're not going to get into the question of why it should be the kohen gadol dying that gets you out of the city of refuge. That's off our track, but definitely a fascinating question. But for our purpose here, the Eidah is being described as the judging body. And the Gemara is particularly interested in is that the Eidah is going to judge, which they're assuming means punish, in the same way as when God says, all right, and against all of the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments. It doesn't mean that God is going to sit there and think carefully about whether the idols did something wrong or not. It means that God is going to destroy them, right? So that use of the word judge to mean to punish certainly exists already in Chumash. We, in this country, have euphemistically labeled our penal system, the justice system, in a way that uses the word very similarly. So they're assuming that that's what Vishaftu Ha'edah and the Eidah will judge means, is that those are the people who are voting to convict. That is, to convict him of deliberate murder so that you put him to death. Vihitzilu Ha'edah, and then there's an Eidah which is rescuing him. Okay, so however many people an Eidah is, I need at least two of them, because I apparently have a vote between an Eidah that wants to kill the guy and an Eidah that wants to rescue him. Okay, so that's what it says. Eidah shofetet, ve'eidah matzelet. An Eidah is judging and another Eidah is rescuing. Harei kan esrim. That gets me to 20. Of course, that skipped a question, which now the Gemara goes back to. Uminayin le'eidah shehi asara. But wait a minute, how do I know that an Eidah is 10? Which the previous line of the Gemara seems to just assume. And here we go to another part of Bamidbar. Shneimar ad matai le'eidah hara'ah hazot. And this is God talking to Moshe about the spies. And he says, for how long do I have to deal with, or I have to tolerate this evil Eidah? So we're Yatsu Yehoshua v'Kalev. We're going to take out Yehoshua and Kalev because they're not bad, right? This is an evil Eidah, and Yehoshua and Kalev aren't evil; they're the good spies, and that gets you 10 evil spies. Not. So now we have. You'll note we've only gotten ourselves to a total of 20 on that court, because we need an Eidah that's voting to convict, and we need an Eidah that's voting to send the guy to the city of refuge instead. That's still only 20. So how do we get the next 3? So that's implied by this pasuk, and here again they quote only a tiny fraction of the pasuk. So let's actually read the whole pasuk. This is not unusual, and when you learn Gemara, it is very much recommended that you look up the whole pasuk, because not only does the pasuk usually not make sense without the whole sentence, but very often the part you actually need is not the part they quote. Although I think that's not true here, but the whole sentence does greatly illuminate the meaning here. So the pasuk is as follows, and it has some phrasing issues in it. Lo tihya acharei rabim l'raot. Don't go after the majority or the many to do evil. V'lo ta'aneh al riv lintot, and don't testify about a fight in order to tilt, presumably to tilt the verdict. Acharei rabim lahatot, after the majority to tilt. So those last three words, acharei rabim lahatot, seem to be either just there for emphasis at the end, right? Why they're explaining why you would testify in order to inappropriately slant a verdict is because you are following the majority, or they're just extra. And the Gemara tends to assume that they're just extra. They're there as a separate thing. But focusing just for a minute on the beginning of the pasuk, don't follow the majority to do something bad. So the Gemara says, well, shomea ani she'ayeh imahem l'tova. If the Torah has to tell me that I'm not allowed to follow the majority to do bad things, it sounds like when the majority are doing something good, I am supposed to follow them. Okay, so that tells me that if there are more people voting to acquit than there are to convict, then the guy can't be killed. Because when you have, let's say, 11 to 10, which is where we are now, I think, because you have to have at least 10 on each side. So to get in a majority, we need 11 to 10. If you have an 11 to 10 vote and 11 people say, let's not kill him, then the other 10 guys now have an obligation to follow the majority to do good. You are in fact supposed to change your mind and follow the majority when it's to do something that is good, however we define that. Which I think here we are taking to mean the more lenient, kinder, gentler position. Okay, but now we need to explain those last three words at the end of the pasuk. In that case, what are we doing with these extra three words at the end of the pasuk? Tilt after the majority, or to tilt after the majority. And in general, the Gemara assumes that these last three words are actually a commandment that means follow the majority. Except that we already learned that from the first half. It said don't follow the majority for something bad. And we already deduced from that if it's not bad, you should follow the majority. So why does the Torah have to tell me again to follow the majority? To tell me, lo hatayatcha letova, hatayatcha l'ra'ah. In order to tell me that you're following the majority, you're tilting after good, should not be like you're tilting after bad. Right? They're different. That's why I can't just learn it by implication from the fact that I shouldn't follow bad, because the thing that I'm actually supposed to do is different than the thing that I'm not supposed to do. So I can't just learn it by implication. Okay, and what's the difference? Hatayatcha letova al pi echad, hatayatcha l'ra'ah al pi shnayim. You're you're tilting to the good, you can do on the speech of one judge, but the following the majority for evil, which in this case is a legitimate legal verdict. By evil, we don't mean something illegal. We do mean killing somebody, but we don't mean something that's wrong in the legal sense, although it's really, really interesting that they're prepared to imply that it's wrong in the moral sense, even though it may be obligatory in the legal sense. That's a fascinating situation. But when you tilt according to the majority for evil, that you need to do by a majority of 2. So if you have a vote of 11 to convict and 10 to acquit, that's a vote for acquittal, because you don't have enough to, or at least it's a hung jury, because you don't have enough to convict. You would need at least 2 more on the conviction side than on the acquittal side. But we need at least 10 on each side. So that gets us to the only way you could convict in that case is with 12 to 10. So we need to have at least 22 judges to make that possible. Okay, the ein beit din shakul, and you can't have a court that's evenly balanced. So you can't have an even number. So mosifina alehem od echad. So we add 1 more, and it's a court of 23, which is right here. So that's 23. Okay, so now we move on to a slightly different question right before we get to the Gemara, which is that it seems like you're supposed to have regional courts of 23, but how big does a town need to be before it qualifies for one of these regional courts? And it's going to turn out that the number is really very, very small, even by relatively ancient standards. And it's going to assume a percentage of the population that is capable of sitting on an expert judging panel that's extraordinarily high. I don't know that the percentage of the population that was capable was anywhere near that high. I don't know that we really had that many educated and qualified judges, but it's possible that some of them rode circuit and they didn't always sit in the same place. I don't know exactly how to do that, because the how many do you need in a city in order for it to be qualified to have a Sanhedrin? 120. It doesn't say 120 what. It could be 120 people. It could be 120 families. It could be 120 adult men, which might amount to the same thing as 120 families or might not. But either way, that's really a really small crowd to have for them 23 expert judges. That's a very high level of expert education in your population to expect. Even if we say this is families and there's 10 or 15 people in a family, that's still a really high percentage of your population that are expert judges. And I'm not entirely sure whether this is aspirational or whether the judges aren't actually dedicated specifically to a city and maybe they ride circuit. I'm not sure exactly how that works. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, Matayim Ushloshim. Rabbi Nechemia says you need 230. Keneged Sarei Asaret, corresponding to the officers of tens. Right. So back in Parshat Yitro, when you may remember at the beginning of Parshat Yitro, Yitro comes to visit the camp either right before or right after the giving of the Torah. That's a dispute between Rashi and Ramban, I believe. Although in the narrative, it's right before the giving of the Torah. And he watches as Moshe spends his entire day with a very long line of people waiting to ask questions and bring petitions. And he says, Moshe, there's no way you can do this by yourself. You get a camp here with 600,000 soldiers in it, which I don't know how many total people that is once you include the elderly and the children and the women, but I'm bare minimum 2 million. It's a lot of people. And Yitro says, there's no way. It's going to destroy you and it's going to destroy them. You need to set up a system of courts of varying level, varying jurisdiction. And it's hierarchical. It starts out at the bottom with officers that are responsible for 10. Again, it's not clear 10 what, but 10 somethings. And then it goes up. I think the top level is officers of 1,000. And then the officers of 1,000 report to Moshe, and that becomes a little bit more manageable. And then Moshe only has to try the cases where none of the other people knew what to do. And again, that becomes doable. So again, it's not clear what these 10s are of. Are they 10 adults, 10 people, 10 adult men, 10 families? I don't know. But whatever it is, Rabbi Nechemia says that's the smallest grouping that we see in the Torah that an individual judge is supposed to be responsible for. And so if you're going to put 23 judges in a city, you need to have a population large enough that each of them can be responsible for that number of people. So whatever we're counting here, and I don't know what it is, you need at least 230 of it in your city, which is almost double what the first position said, but it still sounds small to me. Okay. Now, that's the end of the Mishnah. And the Gemara now is going to refer back to the way the very beginning of the Mishnah started. The very beginning of the Mishnah asserted that certain kinds of law should be decided by a panel of 3 judges. And the first kind of law that was mentioned was Dinei Mamonot, which we translated as cases about money, which we'll keep translating it that way. And then we said gzelot and chavalot, that theft and damages, I translated personal damage because chavala is actually damage that you do to another person's body. Those are also decided by a court of 3. And the first thing the Gemara wants to know is, why isn't the second thing a subset of the first thing, and why are they both on this list? Okay. Well, that should say personal damages, not persona damages. Although that's a really interesting idea, but it should definitely say personal. Okay, so atu gzelot v'chavalot lav dinei mamonot ninhu. So the Gemara says, wait, so that implies that theft and personal damages aren't cases about money? Really? Rabbi Abahu Mahin Katani. So Rabbi Abahu says it's teaching in the style of Mahin, of what are they, which is to say you name a category and then you list things that are inside the category. That's a relatively reasonable way to organize your speech. And now he lays out exactly what the expanded version would be. Mahin dine mamonot gezelot v'chavalot. Aval hodaot v'halvaot lo. So what it means is, what are dine mamonot? What are cases about money? By the way, this entire series, you'll see that the documents that I'm sending you are labeled Dinei Mamonot Bishlosha. That's the Hebrew name for the chapter, because those are the first 3 words in the Mishnah. So what are Dinei Mamonot? Dinei Mamonot are Gzelot and Chavalot. So cases about money are cases about theft or personal damage, but not loans, not admissions and not loans. So it seems that we're saying that whatever it is the Mishnah said about cases about money, which at the moment seems to be that it's judged by a panel of 3 judges, although we'll see in next week's share that the Gemara does not think that that's what we're talking about. But for right now, we're going to assume that, because that seems to be the most basic meaning of the Mishnah. That's true about some kinds of laws about money, but it's not true about other kinds. And the kinds that it's true about are the ones that are listed in the Mishnah, and the ones that are not listed in the Mishnah, which is to say loans and people admitting that they owe people money, those are decided in some other way by some other group of people under some other set of rules of procedure. They're different. Okay, so in that case, why couldn't the Mishnah tell us that with a lot fewer words? In particular, why didn't it just say that theft and personal damages are decided by a court of 3? Why does it need to talk about cases about money at all if that's not if the big category isn't, if it's not true about the big category that it's decided by 3 judges? So vitzrich. So the Gemara says, no, we do need it. We need all of the parts. Di'itana dine mamonot hava amina da'afilu hodaot v'halvaot. Because if it had only taught me the words dine mamonot, if it had only said laws about cases about money are decided by 3 judges, then I would have thought that that was even true of loans and admissions. Sorry, admissions and loans. Therefore, Tana gzelot v'chavalot. That's why it had to teach that the category that's decided by 3 judges is theft and personal damages. V'itana gzelot v'chavalot. And if, on the other hand, it had only said thefts and damages, then the loktani dine mamonot, and it had not said that in general cases about money are decided by 3 judges, then I would have had a different misimpression. I would have thought, hava amina, hu hadin da'afilu hodaot v'halvaot. I would have thought that I was supposed to extend that to other similar cases, to, in particular, loans and admissions. I would have thought, well, when it says theft and damages, but it meant that, stuff that's like thefts and damages. In which case, I would have had to have a theory in my mind about why it specifically said thefts and damages. So now the Gemara tells me what that theory would have been. V'hai diktani gzelot v'chavalot, and the fact that it said thefts and personal damages, I would have assumed that that was mishum di'ikar gimel ketivi b'gzelot v'chavalot ketivi. That when the main idea of three judges was written in the Torah. It was written with respect to theft and personal damages. And I might have thought that, well, those are the sort of cases, those are the original cases. So it's talking about that. But the truth is that I'm supposed to use logic to extend it to all other similar cases. Now, the Gemara takes a little bit of a tangent to explain that derivation. So, Gzelot, Dichtiv, V'nikrav Bal Habayit El Elohim. Then that is Elohim. That's why I left the hey. It's talking about people here. And in that case, we were talking about a person who was entrusted with an object by somebody else. The object gets stolen, and the person who was taking care of it says, I can't give it back to you because it was stolen, but I didn't do anything to it, so I shouldn't have to pay you for it. And so it says, V'nikrav Bal Habayit El Elohim, the homeowner, that's the guy who was taking care of the object, is caused to approach the judges. And then what happens there is if he can swear that he didn't, that it's not his fault and that he didn't use it, then he doesn't have to pay. But we're interested very technically in the word ha-Elohim, which is plural. So that means he has to approach a plural group of judges, and remembering again that we don't believe in judging in groups of even numbers, Rabbi Yehuda and his 70 elders notwithstanding, the smallest plural number, if you're not willing to tolerate even numbers, the smallest plural number is 3. Okay, so that gets you making decisions about theft, although in this case, the person being judged is actually not the thief. The person being judged is the person, the unwitting caretaker who was trying to prevent the theft and failed to prevent it. But it is a case of theft. And that case is judged by a plural panel, which we're taking to be a panel of 3. Okay, so that's the source for 3 judges, which incidentally was missing in the Mishnah. The Mishnah derived 23 for us, and it derived 70 or 71 for us, but it did not derive 3. This is that derivation, and it's in a context of a theft. Chavalot, mali chaval begufo, mali chaval b'mamono. So, and how do I know that you're supposed to judge a case of personal damages with a panel of 3? Well, there I just use logic. What difference does it make whether you stole his stuff or you stole part of his body? Either way, it's the same kind of case. Now, that is not the world's strongest logic. It seems to me that you could make at least that strong a logical connection between stealing stuff and borrowing things and then refusing to give them back. But apparently we're making one connection and not the other. Okay, and probably that's because at the time when we're constructing this, we already know that we've long since, possibly hundreds of years since, decided to use this pasuk in Shemot 22 to derive 3 judges, and that we've already long since decided to use this piece of logic to derive 3 judges for personal damages. And that's just sort of part of the decided pre-existing case law, that's where we did it, and we didn't decide to make the other connection. Okay, in any case, what you might have done is you might have said, well, it says you should have 3 judges for theft and personal damages, but it just said that because those are the cases we derived it from, and I'm going to use another leap of logic to get it to all other cases about money, and that's exactly what the Mishnah is trying to prevent you from doing, as it says, Tana mahin dine mamonot gzelot v'chavalot aval hodaot v'halvaot lo. That's why it teaches you, and now we're looking at the sort of modified version that we're working with of the Mishnah now, the expanded version, not the words that were actually in the Mishnah. What are cases about money? They are theft and damages and personal damages, but not admissions and loans. Okay. But now we need to confront the issue, which we're not really going to confront tonight. We're mostly going to confront it next week, but we'll touch on it very lightly now, of what it is that we're trying to exclude admissions and loans from. In what way is the judicial procedure for adjudicating whether I owe somebody money different if the reason I owe them money is because I borrowed money from them? I mean, they say I borrowed money from them, or they say that I admitted that I owe them money. In what way is that procedure different than the procedure if the reason why they're suing me for me to pay them money is because they say that I stole their money, or because they say that I punched them in the nose? Right? In all of these cases, I'm being sued to pay somebody money. But we are claiming that the kind of court procedure under which you try the case is going to be different depending on what kind of claim the complainant is using to claim that I owe them money. Okay, so ilema de ba'inan shlosha. So if we say that the difference is the requirement for 3 judges, sorry, ilema de lo ba'inan shlosha. If we say that they don't require 3 judges, we have a problem with that, because v'ha'amar Rabbi Abahu shnayim shedanu dinei mamonot l'divrei hakol ein dineihem din. Rabbi Abahu claims, and he doesn't just claim it about himself, he claims it about everybody. He claims that across the board, all positions hold that if 2 judges judge a case about money, it's not a judgment. It doesn't count. You have not yet had the court case, and you have to start again from scratch. So if Rabbi Abahu says that there isn't anybody who thinks you can judge any kind of financial case with only 2 judges, and we'll get to whether that's really true or not next week, but for right now, we're going to buy that. If that were true, then it can't be that the reason that loans and concessions are different is because they don't require 3 judges, because it sounds like Rabbi Abahu thinks that you can't decide any case that somebody owes somebody else money with fewer than 3 judges. So
Deborah,
yeah.
why couldn't a single judge judge a case like that?
Okay, we will get to single judges, I think, also next week, or maybe the week after. I think we're assuming as of right now that there would be a kal v'chomer between 2 and 3, that if you didn't accept 2, you definitely wouldn't accept 1. That might or might not be true, because it might be that we just really don't like even numbers.
Right.
But we seem to have a strong prejudice that if you leave things up to one person, there's just too much of a chance of
bias,
or even just an erratic judgment that doesn't represent what people would normally think. That you get more consistency if you have more people collaborating together on the decision. Right. I don't know if that's really true, but it might be.
Okay.
But so what the Gemara's tentative decision, which is what we're going to leave it at for tonight, is Ella de lo ba'inan mumchen. It must be that the difference between these 2 kinds of cases is that while theft or personal damages requires expert judges, people who are experts in the law, the adjudicating cases about loans or admissions do not require expert judges. Now, that sounds a lot like you can just, pick up some random guys on a street corner and ask them to force somebody to repay your loan for you. And as we will see next week, it's not exactly that, but it's not so different than that either. But remember that there's a difference between making people repay loans and making people pay money because they did something wrong, right? If I punch you in the nose, I've done something wrong. If I steal your piano, I've done something wrong. Making me pay because I did something wrong is the sort of thing where you're hoping you have as few cases like that as is humanly possible. You'd prefer people didn't behave that way to begin with. And you can take your time about it. It doesn't, you don't need to make the system super efficient so that you can have as many cases as possible. Whereas when it comes to collecting loans, the truth is that at least at the beginning of the loan, it is in the interest of society for it to be as easy as possible for people who need money to borrow money. And the harder you make it in the mind of the lender, it doesn't actually matter whether it's real or not, but in the mind of the lender, the harder you make it to recoup your money at the end of the loan period, the harder it is going to be at the beginning for the person who needs money to borrow the money. And so we might actually have an incentive to make the collection efficient in the case of loans, where we don't really want to incentivize people to get punched in the nose. Like, that's not a thing. In fact, if you have people who are running an insurance scam in which they get themselves punched in the nose so they can get paid, we would prefer to disincentivize that. I don't know whether people did that then. Certainly there are cases in the 20th century of people doing exactly that. So maybe human nature doesn't change and it's always been a thing. But there's certainly, we don't have any interest in incentivizing behavior there, whereas we do with loans, and that's going to be important. And that is going to, whatever it is that we're doing here, and we're tentatively for the moment saying that we require a lower level of expertise on the part of the judges, it's going to end up being in order to make the lending process more appear to be in the favor of the lender, so that the lender will be willing to enter into this process to begin with. Much as it is not necessarily in the best interest of the borrower, and that might be problematic, but it's even less in the interest of the borrower for him not to get to be a borrower to start with. Okay, that is the end of what I have for this evening. Are there questions?
So in that society, there was a huge discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots.
I mean, I think all societies have a huge discrepancy between haves and have-nots, but our society also has a very dramatic discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots, and it is even in our society where we have lots of different ways of borrowing money, and you can even borrow money at interest, which was not a thing in the Gemara. It is still almost impossible for poor people to get credit, precisely because the people doing the lending don't think they're going to get their money back.
Right.
So I would not say this problem has been solved. And if you take away banks that, I guess are corporations and can kind of afford to lose the money because it's not like they have children who are going to starve if they don't get the money. Mm-hmm. And you take away the idea of charging interest, and you're left with people who are actually lending their own spending money and can't charge interest on it. So I would imagine the problem's worse in that circumstance.
Right. Just it seems like, and I think I've learned this in other parts of Gemara too, that we're bending over backwards to make it easy for people to lend money. So there must have been a large population of people who really needed it.
It's very hard to know how many people are involved in any of the things the Gemara talks about, and to what extent things are dealt with a lot because they're important rather than because they're frequent, or the other way around, because they're frequent rather than important.
Right.
Or in a lot of cases, because something makes an interesting test case, even though it never happens. It's just really, really hard to know. In this case, my guess would be that it is both important and frequent, and it's not an interesting test case. But anytime you see something being discussed, you kind of have to ask yourself, is this here because it's a useful case to illustrate something? Or is it here because it really came up? And if it really came up, how often did it come up? Or was it just super important? And some cases, I would say, are very obvious one way or the other.
Yeah.
This one tends to feels to me real, not imaginary. Unlike a case that we're, could get to years and years in the future if we kept going. It's about 80 pages in front of us in Sanhedrin, in which somebody shoots an arrow and then runs faster than the arrow and takes away the shield from the person they shot the arrow at before the arrow gets there. I would say that that's an interesting test case that never happened.
Right.
This feels to me like a real case.
Yeah.
That one, by the way, is not physically impossible if you just shoot the arrow straight up in the air.
Yeah.
But you'd have to do something like that in order to travel faster than the arrow, and So, but here, this feels to me real, and it, as I said, it speaks to a real problem, which once you get to the Middle Ages and there's extensive responsa literature, and then you get to today, it seems to be a sort of a perennial problem.
Right.
The people who most need money are also the people who are most unlikely to pay it back, and therefore most unlikely to get lent to.
Yeah.
Also, on this topic, also making it easier to borrow within the Jewish community should reduce the chance of people borrowing outside of the Jewish community, where they're more likely to have interest, and where if there are disputes, they are likely to turn into community relations problems.
Yeah, that is certainly true. Also, there may or may not be attractive prospects for lending there either. And it may be that your chances of getting money from people who at least feel a connection to you are greater. There are, by the way, well, I think they're usually called Hebrew free loan societies in this country, where you can give your tzedakah money to a fund that does nothing but lend money without interest to Jewish people who need money, who then pay it back when they can. And that's Yad Chesed, I think, does it as a part of what they do. I think there is also a free loan society of New England or Massachusetts and Rhode Island or something like that. There is a local one, which is an excellent thing to have and an excellent thing to lend money to. To give money to. But as I said, this is a continuing and perennial problem. Okay, so I will let you go. I'll see you all next Monday night.
Thanks so much, Deborah.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.